So welcome back to the Comfortable Car Club. Now I've been trying to make this video on useless things that cars have for years and years and years. I've never been able to get the right title. I've never been able to decide what I was going to do. So here goes. I've managed to whittle them down to 4 things that I really despise in cars and I think are useless. And if people sat down and thought about it, they would also realize how useless they really were. So here goes. The very first thing is leather seats. Now I had leather seats in my cars, plural, in my last 2 cars over a period of 10 years, and I never understood what the appeal of leather was. I once got into a bit of an argument with a friend of mine and I asked him, what's so special about leather? Why is leather good? And his reply was, because it is. That was the best he had. So that's a bit shaky right there. Now you could argue it's more comfortable or something, but that's ridiculous because my Volvo S60, that was really comfortable, some of the best seats I've ever sat on, and the Mazda 6, not so much, actually rather crap. It's the padding that makes a difference, not the material, the final millimetre or 2 on the outside. You could argue that it's easy to wipe down. I'll give you that. In the many years I had leather, I never wiped it down. But if you need it more often than I do, then yeah, that's a valid argument. But leather has some extreme disadvantages. It's more expensive, for one thing. And what are you getting for that? Slippery ride. Sometimes certain clothing I would wear would slip about on the seats, and I didn't like that at all. In colder weather, it was very cold to the touch, and it took a bit to warm up. Cloth doesn't have that disadvantage. The worst part was in the summer, and that's when you got shorts, lots of skin exposed, and I'm a bloke, and women have even more skin exposed. And when you sit in a car that has leather upholstery that's been out in the sun for a while, you get scorched thighs and arms. It's horrible. It's ridiculous. And even after you set off and the leather has cooled down, it still sticks to the skin. And I'm saying this because this car has partial leather seats, but I'm not partial to the leather myself. I think I already used that joke, but I'm not sure. Even though they're partial leather, I'm not partial to leather. But it's got cloth. And that's what really counts to me. It's got this lovely cloth which makes it good. Leather is just ridiculous. Why? Why do people like leather? I have a theory why people think leather is so good. I think it's just because it's always been the posher option for seating upholstery. There was a time when basic cars had vinyl seats. Vinyl is awful, horrible, horrible. And you could go up a step and it would be like velour, cloth. And of course the swankiest upholstery you could have was leather. I don't know why, but yeah, maybe it's just because it was expensive. And it's stuck with people, and people still think leather is the best option, even though if they sat down and thought about it, they'd probably reach the conclusion that it wasn't. Looking posh and feeling special counts for a lot. I understand that. Here in this country where I live in, and Spain, next door, they joined the European Union in 1986. And then in the early 90s, you really saw how easy credit made people buy nicer and nicer cars. They weren't obliged to drive the same econo boxes, the Fiat 127s and the Renault 5s and Opel Corsas. They could buy nice and swankier cars. And I also think many people in Eastern Europe can also relate, because in the 90s, at the very same time, by coincidence, their economies also started to pick up and people were able to drive nicer cars. And of course, if you want a nice swanky car, you also want the nice posh options, and leather was one of them, and I understand that. It's just such an overrated material. It really is. So if the preceding criticism of leather seats is going to be unpopular, I think this will be as well. And the next one is Xenon headlamps. So what's my beef with Xenon headlamps? Well, I think they're absolutely and utterly overrated, and they're only really put on cars because they're sort of like expensive options. They make them look posher, and people will be fooled and spend more money and say, oh, look how posh. A bit like leather seats, basically. Now, I had Xenon headlamps on my previous car, the Mazda 6, and I failed to see any advantage. Again, just like leather seats. I saw no real improvement of visibility, both in town and out of town. Out of town, what really counts are main beams, and my main beams, and most cars that have Xenon headlamps have main beams that are halogen. That's the more conventional type of lamp. And in town, it doesn't really matter what kind of lamp you have. What matters is being seen, because in terms of actual visibility, what you, the driver, see, that's determined by the public illumination around you. Now, there are a couple of arguments that people who like Xenon headlamps will foist upon you, saying, for example, it's more efficient. It is more efficient. But I also found some time ago in an article, and apologies, I can't find it anymore, an article that said that one of the German manufacturers, Audi, BMW, Mercedes, one of them, tried to measure exactly how much fuel was saved by xenon headlamps, and the amount saved was so small as to be either immeasurable or insignificant. And then some people will say that no, they last a lot longer. Aha! That neatly brings me on to one of its disadvantages, and that is cost. They're very expensive, and they don't last long enough to offset the cost of halogen lamps. How should I put this? Give you a practical example to so you know what I'm on about. On my Mazda, I bought the Mazda, it was about 13 years old, and it probably had original xenon headlamps, and I had to replace both of them, and each one cost 130 euros, and that included labour. Remember that. My current car, the Citroen C5, I also had to replace both dipped beams, some H7s if I'm not mistaken, and they cost 10 euros each, and I could do it myself. So for a xenon headlamp, just to break even in terms of cost, it would have to last at least 13 times longer than the halogen lamp. And I've actually had the halogen lamps on my car for over 2 years, but let's say for sake of argument that they last 2 years. That would mean the xenon headlamps would have to last at least 13 times longer, and that's just to break even. So the argument that it's sort of like ends up being cheaper is completely erroneous. I've found out for myself that is not true. And we go back to that thing about labour and being able to change the halogens myself and having to pay extra for labour for the xenon headlamps. Now, xenon headlamps are more expensive just by themselves, but you probably have to pay someone to do it. And why is that? If you look in the manual, for example, in this car's manual, it says halogen dip beams. This is how you change it, and it shows you, you know, undo that dust cover, put it in, whatever. Xenon headlamps, go to the dealer. And that's what most car manuals will say, because usually for xenon headlamps, you have to probably remove the entire light cluster or lots of trim and body parts around it. So it's not something you can easily do yourself. I can probably imagine many of you watching this and saying, oh, I could do it in my garage myself. You probably could, but not all of us have the garage, not all of us have the inclination or the time or the ability. So it's a very, very debatable point at best. And finally, we go back to visibility. Actually, xenon headlamps in poor weather is actually not the best option, because on xenon headlamps, their light tends towards the blue part of the spectrum, while in contrast, halogen is to the yellow part of the spectrum. Blue light tends to be scattered more with poor conditions. So visibility is not improved with xenon headlamps. In fact, that was one of the reasons the French gave for having yellow headlamps on their cars from 1939 onwards up until 1992, early 90s. So yeah, xenon headlamps are completely and utterly overrated. So hopefully you've made it this far and haven't already switched off the video and typed in a very angry comment saying what an idiot I am. Let's move on to the next silly feature that cars have that are purported to be brilliant, but aren't. Number 3 on the list is sat-nav. Now, I know many of you are going, what are you talking about? Sat-nav is essential on a car. Well, I think some probably already know what I'm trying to get at. Now, there was a time when having sat-nav in a car was good, but that time was the 2000s. Since then, thanks to the proliferation of smartphones and, of course, also data plans, it's now possible to have what people pay extra to have in a car already in your pocket. Now, in the Western world, many people already have smartphones, and these smartphones usually come with some kind of app. For example, in my case, I've got an Android phone, so it's got Google Maps, and it's free to use, and it's always up to date. So why would I be paying extra to have the same thing in my car, but with the difference that what's in my car, I have to update every now and then, and it costs money. Why would I do that? Even if I don't have a smartphone, if I want to buy a new smartphone, I can buy one for practically the same price as a sat-nav system. I did some research some time ago, I don't know if it's still current, but in a BMW 1 Series, which is a premium car, and a Renault Clio, which isn't a premium car, both cars had sat-nav as €1,000 options. And for that money, you can get a pretty good smartphone. And then sat-navs have also one big problem, is they age terribly. I remember a friend of mine with a sat-nav in 2011, and we used to commute to and from work 100 miles a day or 160 kilometers. And his sat-nav was 2 years old at the time. It's 2013. A couple of years later, it was hopeless. It looked horribly outdated and pixelated and slow. And of course, the maps were out of date. Why would you want to, for example, buy that in a second-hand car? Why do people use that as selling points? Because old sat-navs are absolutely trash. They're obsolete, they're out of date, they're useless. And in fact, having it as an integral part of the car these days, especially with things like Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, why would you even bother having it as an option? So yeah, I think it's more or less indisputable that sat-nav in a car. I have heard one person try to argue, no, it's a good thing in a car. It was on Reddit, and he said because you get a 7-inch touchscreen in the car instead of, like, for example, a 6.5-inch touchscreen on a phone. And finally, my biggest bugbear, my bête noire, the thing I hate the most in cars these days, is the touchscreen. It sort of summarizes everything wrong with modern cars. It's something that's stupidly overcomplicated. It's great for car manufacturers because then they get one single supplier. Whereas if it was buttons and knobs, they need someone to design those buttons, design those knobs, have them molded, have them produced in series. It'll probably be a lot more expensive and more complicated for the manufacturer. For the consumer, it's something that looks glitzy and cool and colourful. Oh, look at that. But if one pixel dies, that's it. The whole thing has to be taken out and replaced at great expenses, and not something you can do yourself at home, or at least not easily. You probably need the software, and that's a bit harder to come by. And people will say, no, but it's something that allows you to have options and extra things in cars. Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose, but then things go too far. For example, in a Tesla, you can open the sunroof 64% or 79%. Who cares? I've never lain awake at night thinking, oh God, I wish I had a car where I could open the sunroof to exactly 93%. It just doesn't happen. People are given way too many options that they never really ever utilize. Maybe once when the car is new and thing is, oh, look at this thing the car does. Apart from that, it's rubbish. And then, of course, there's the safety thing, which is probably the biggest reason not to have a touchscreen in a car in the first place. You're driving along, you're looking at the road, and you have to look away and stab at a surface with no tactile feedback. Now, tactile feedback in a car is pretty important. It means you can keep your eyes on the road, look away, fiddle with a dial, press a button, doesn't matter. It's something that you know has worked because you've felt it. Touchscreens don't have that. Touchscreens are ridiculous. Most touchscreens that I've used are absolutely shambolic to use, and they're just a dumb piece of equipment to have in a car. Of course, all Tesla owners go, no, it isn't. But it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Proof that it's ridiculous is how, for example, Citroën, and I know I am biased because I'm a Citroën fan, but Citroën had, for example, in its latest C3, the temperature controls only accessible via the touchscreen. And now in the latest generation C4, it's some dials you can access easily physically without having to go through the touchscreen. That's proof that people maybe aren't that satisfied with having to go fumbling through menus to get to a certain function. And that, yeah, for example, here's a guy fumbling through menus in a Tesla Model 3 to turn on the bloody windscreen wipers. How ridiculous is that? I want a windscreen wiper immediately. Snap. Just go like that with my hand and it works. Not fumble through 3 or 4 screens and get it wrong, and then having to look and prod and make sure it works. Touchscreens, they're manure, they're excrement, they're crap. To hell with touchscreens. So if you've made it this far, thank you very much. I hope you won't leave in a blind rage. Tell me what you think below, and you can find any of these things that I've mentioned to be absolutely fundamental in the car. That's absolutely fine now. You do you, I do me, and we can disagree. Either way, if you didn't think what I did was absolutely loathsome, please leave a like, subscribe, share, etc, 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 all that YouTube stuff. And thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video. I bid you farewell.